There are a number of people who don't believe they really have that bad of an addiction or that strong of an addiction to nicotine because of how long they seem to be able to go at times where they don't even think about cigarettes. You'll hear some people say they can go, several hours and they don't think about cigarettes. Now, people have been forced to learn how to do this. And there's a few actions that they may take to be able to pull this off. One of them, the obvious one, is like if they work in a job that doesn't allow them to smoke, oh, they chain smoke on the way to that job. They get their nicotine level so high, but by the time they get into their office, they're so poisoned from nicotine. The last thing is, how much do you need a cigarette right now? And this high level of nicotine may get them through an hour or two where they don't really have any desire whatsoever. But hey, let's say they get to work at 8 and they're in a non-smoking company and they really can't get to a cigarette until 12. Somehow, even though the nicotine level is dropped, you figure by 10, they're still going pretty long without thinking about a cigarette, from 10 to 11 and maybe to 12. It's interesting, though, on this training mechanism that goes in place. And this isn't new. Oh, yeah, smoking restrictions in the workplace, they've been around for a while in some areas. But, there were populations, even before the current smoking restrictions went into effect, there were groups that couldn't smoke who were smokers. The most obvious one that I always referred to were teachers. You got a kindergarten or first grade teacher that couldn't leave the students, for the full time period between 8 o'clock and 12 o'clock. They were fine during the 9 and 10 and 11 hour, even though they had not smoked since 8 a.m. and now it's 11 a.m. and even though they probably oversmoked going into the class, even though all that's true, at 11 o'clock, they're still probably not thinking about a cigarette. They've trained themselves that they can't smoke at 11. They just can't do it. They don't seem to think about it. When the bell would ring at lunchtime, if you think it was the students that were excited to get out of class, it often was the teacher who was extremely excited. As a matter of fact, if a little kid all of a sudden comes up to the teacher at the moment after that bell rang, that teacher could churn inside. They were prepped to be able to go this 4-hour period. Again, they learned by force how to do that. But when it went any longer than that, these people became a mess, almost upset with the kid. Couldn't show it, but upset that they were now going into their smoking time. When I used to talk about this, not everybody I had was teachers, of course, so I tried to think of other examples. And I was working primarily in the northern Chicago suburbs when I was doing my clinics for a 20-some year period in this one location. Well, the story that I would tell that would a lot of the people would relate to, not just teachers, was there was a train line that would run from the north part of Chicago, from the northern border of Chicago, into downtown Chicago. So a lot of people used this line who were commuters to get downtown. And this train had this really nasty habit. When you get onto the train in the subway, now for decades you have not been able to smoke on the train. The subway was in downtown Chicago, and it was like a 40-minute ride, 45-minute ride from downtown Chicago to the northern border of Chicago. It was something like that. And people who would get in on the subway, you would often see them chain smoke before they'd get on the train. They'd get their nicotine level up, and then the train would start its little trip every day from the south end, or the downtown area, which is the south side now for their trip, all the way to the north side. And the train would end at what was called Howard Street. And there was a real interesting practice that train used to do when it would get near Howard Street. Now, the reason I'm trying to lay out this whole scenario, because it was actually it was humorous. I was a commuter watching this often, and this is why I learned a lot of my understanding of smokers by watching smokers. It wasn't by reading about smokers in books. It was watching smokers in their natural environment. What would happen at the Howard L, people would, all of a sudden, when they were about 3 or 4 blocks away, and especially if they could see out the front window, they would see the platform at the Howard station. And the smokers all would almost, you could see they were getting a little bit on the edgy side. They were getting a little bit anticipatory. You would see them go into their pocket and pull out the package of cigarettes, often have them in their hand. Some of the people are playing with the pack. Some of them were actually getting the cigarette out of the pack and sometimes putting the cigarette in their mouth and having the lighter in their hand right about here, and the cigarettes in their mouth and the lighters in the hand. But they can't actually light the cigarette. They get arrested. They'll get fined. They can't do that. But they're prepped. They're getting ready. Now, for some reason, the Howard train, when it got about 20 or 30 feet from the platform, as soon as it pulled up to the platform, the doors were going to open and they were going to walk into the platform. These people were going to light up. But when it got about 20 or 30 feet from the platform, the train would stop. Just stop. There's nothing in front of it. There's nothing behind it. The train would just stop and sit there. And the smokers, you could see, were getting more and more on edge. They're so close to the platform. They're so close where they can light up, but they can't light up. It's like the teacher who thought they were going to be able to light a cigarette as soon as they got out of that room at 12 o'clock exactly, but the little kid comes up and interferes. And how they never caught on to this, I don't know, because it did it every single time, but you would see them getting edgier and edgier. Like, when is this train going to move? And I always pointed out to my groups that if the train had stopped, 30 feet before a platform that was miles away from Howard Street, if it was, people were going all the way to Howard, but they stopped where Sheridan was, and this was 4 or 5 stops before Howard Street, you wouldn't see the smokers getting on edge and getting their cigarettes out. No, they couldn't light up until they got to Howard, and they knew that. But once they were in sight of Howard, these people were becoming a mess. So what you could see happens is people could train themselves to go so long in withdrawal, basically in discomfort, and they get used to that. But when it goes any longer, and sometimes we're talking about seconds longer, these people are suffering. Then you get the people who say, but they can go a day or two sometimes without smoking. Yeah, these people have trained themselves to suffer for 48 hours and think that that's normal. Who these people typically were people who smoked at work when smoking was allowed, but they weren't allowed to smoke in their homes. They had children who were allergic to cigarettes. They had spouses who hated their smoking, and so they wouldn't smoke in the house. And weekends, basically, they learned they can't smoke, unless they could break away from the family every now and then, but sometimes they couldn't. And they would learn to go 48 hours without smoking, and in a sense, they're not thinking about cigarettes a lot during that because they train themselves to put up with withdrawal and not think about it. Do you know what these people dread almost more than anything else on a regular basis? What these people dread in life? 3-day weekends. Oh my God. Or vacations. Those are even worse. But a 3-day weekend. See, they know they can go 2 days. They learn to go 2 days. But all of a sudden, they go into that third day. They're not ready for it. Where this is really a more tragic kind of issue is where I would hear people who would say they would try to quit. And they would make a day or two and they couldn't take it anymore and they'd throw in the towel. And sometimes you'd hear people say, oh, they made it into the third day and then it got really bad and they threw in the towel. When I heard of someone who would say this on the third day, this was tragic. Because you got to understand something. Withdrawal is a 72-hour peak withdrawal period maximum, meaning some people peak on day 1, some people peak on day 2, and some on day 3. The lower the nicotine level is getting, the more the person is wanting a cigarette. When you hear a person say, oh, they made it a day or 2 and then they lost it, I couldn't even tell them, well, the next day would have been better. I can't say that. But the people who were in their third day, they went through this time period that was really rough. And if they had just gone to bed that night and didn't take the cigarette and woke up the next morning, there's a really, really good chance it was going to be a whole lot better that next day. But they threw the towel in, at which point they're starting all over again, if they ever start all over again and facing that whole situation again. People can train themselves to go extended time periods without smoking. But you got to understand what these people's lives are like. It's actually the lives of most people who are smokers today in societies that don't let them smoke. They're either over smoking or under smoking all the time. Again, going to a job where you can't smoke, you chain smoke. You get so much nicotine into you, by the time you get there, you're poisoned. You feel crummy. The last thing in your mind is how much you want a cigarette. But then after a few hours, it finally stabilizes to the level it should be. But then in a matter of a few minutes, now you're going into withdrawal, and then you're in withdrawal until you can get to the next break or lunch or whatever, or end of the day when you can get to a cigarette. At which point you probably chain smoke, getting yourself poisoned again because of how fast you're taking it in, because of how crummy you're feeling. This is a horrible way to live. Over smoking or under smoking all the time. When smoking used to be allowed everywhere, and I mean everywhere, at your doctor's office, at your non-smoking friends' homes who would have ashtrays for you. Some even really polite ones would have cigarettes around just in case, people would run out. When this is where society was at, well, smoking was great. You never dealt with withdrawal. You smoked all the time at a constant pace. You didn't oversmoke all the time. You didn't have to oversmoke. You delivered it as you needed it. 20 or 30-minute intervals. You'd light a cigarette. 20 or 30 minutes later, you would light a cigarette. You wouldn't have to oversmoke or undersmoke. But in today's reality, you're chain smoking when you can get the cigarettes in, and you're in withdrawal after a certain time period after having oversmoked, and then you're suffering until you can get to cigarettes again and then over smoking again. It's a horrible existence. It's an existence that ends once you quit smoking. Yeah, for a few days you may feel some discomfort, but come on. You may have been going through years. You may now have been going through decades of constant discomfort because of the way you couldn't deliver nicotine as you needed it. Once you quit, and you get it out of your system, there's no longer this cycle of over-smoking, under-smoking all the time. You just don't smoke anymore. And there's no withdrawal involved once you get through the initial 3-day period. And again, for some people it's a 1 day, and some it's a 2, and some it's nothing. Once you get through it, you'll never have to deal with it again. Your life becomes much more comfortable, much cheaper, and much safer. And to maintain this easier way of life, it's just a matter of sticking to the personal commitment that you hopefully made the day you stopped to never take another puff.